going to talk to you about how Mrs. Curwen teaches a quarter note to her students. And this is not all done in one lesson. This is basically me taking a series of lessons and taking the thread that she uses to teach a quarter note and combining them into one video so we can see the overarching principle and method that she uses to teach a quarter note, and then also other note values as well. So a few things to keep in mind is, first of all, Mrs. Curwen disregards the name. So the name quarter note she does not use because she feels like that name is rather meaningless to a 7-year-old who may be beginning lessons around that age. She also feels like the name does not really represent the note value very well. So to avoid confusion or anything somewhat meaningless to the child, she just disregards the name for this time and will introduce it later on as the child understands first what a quarter note is, and then she presents the name and the symbol, and we'll get on to that. And also, if you read her book, you'll never see the word quarter note, because in London at the time, and even maybe today, I'm not completely sure, they use the words crochet and minim and semi-breve for quarter note, half note, and whole note. So those names are a little bit different in the book if you're reading through and you're like, what is a semi-breve? So that's what those are, the note names. So she doesn't use the note names. She also, as she teaches the quarter note, she uses the underlying principle that a quarter note equals 1 pulse. So even though that's not always true in all time signatures, she refers to one of her maxims, which are the principles she uses to teach music, that she says to teach one fact at a time and the commonest fact first. And the most common meter or time signature is that a quarter note equals 1 pulse. So that's how we're going to refer to it for this time as well. So beginning with preliminary lesson 1, this is the very first lesson a child would have. She recommends to the teacher to find a piece of music that has a very strong pulse. So I use a march-like song somewhat like this, and we'll listen to just a brief clip now. Okay, so we just listened to a short clip of that piece by Beethoven, and this is what I would play to have a child march or to clap to the music. I would offer very little instruction, just tell them to listen and to march or to clap. And then at the end of their very first lesson, I would send them home upon Mrs. Curwen's recommendation with homework to continue listening to music and to march or to clap to that music as well. Okay, so now we've moved on to preliminary lesson 2. We ended preliminary lesson 1 talking about clapping or marching to music. Preliminary lesson 2, we're going to refer to this marching or clapping as the ability to feel the pulse or the throb in music. So we're going to elaborate upon what this pulse or this throb is, and we're also going to introduce accent and measure. So the first thing is we talk about pulse. That this pulse in music is what allowed a student to clap or to march, whether it's quickly or slowly. There is a pulse or a throb in music that is consistent, and you can also refer to like the tick of a clock as an example of something else that is completely consistent and regular as well. So at this point, Mrs. Curwen talks about a nota bene in her music, and this is basically a note she wants you to read and understand and not to gloss over. So I'm just going to read this paragraph to you. She says, "The sense of rhythm is rarely altogether wanting, but it may be more or less acute. The child may be accustomed to marching and doing exercises to music at school and be an expert. If so, he can go straight on with the lessons on time. But if there is any difficulty, he must remain at this stage until his ear is so far trained that he can march or clap independently of the teacher's help, taking his tempo from the music alone. Pulse is the foundation fact of all that we call time in music, and if the child cannot feel the pulse, it goes without saying that he cannot realize accent and measure and the various developments and modifications of rhythm." So Mrs. Curwen is telling us, as a teacher, do not cram this concept of feeling the pulse in music. It is what a child must be able to do to really, truly understand what a quarter note is. So she moves on talking about accent and how some of the pulses in music are stronger than others. So if we think about a waltz with a strong, weak, weak, strong, weak, weak type pulse, she also refers to using nursery rhymes like hickory dickory dock, the mouse ran up the clock. So this is a strong, weak, strong, weak. The clock struck one, the mouse ran down, hickory dickory dock. So she's trying to allow the child to understand this strong accent versus weak accents. Some of my greatest results have been using the sound of a train, like a puff, 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 puff. So they can feel that strong versus the weak accent. And so she uses this strong accent to introduce what a measure is, because these strong accents that come regularly, either once every 4 notes, once every 3 notes, or once every 2 notes, these strong and accented pulses are measured by the music. It's almost like a fence post in a fence. So we have these strong accents that measure the music. So then with that, we move on to preliminary lesson 3. So we are now going to let a child hear what a 1 pulse note is versus, for example, a 2 pulse or 3 pulse note. And this is a really great simple piece from Farm Scenes that you can use to just play for a child on the piano and have them raise their hand when they hear a note that lasts more than 1 pulse. Okay, so we've just helped a child identify a 1 pulse sound, and hopefully they've been able to identify when there's a sound that lasts more than 1 pulse. So the next we're going to assign that 1 pulse note a name, and she just uses the simple name of ta. And we will refer to these 1 pulse notes singing the sound of ta for quite some time. So basically, a 1 pulse note the teacher would sing and then the child would imitate, or the teacher would play on the piano and then the child would imitate. Mrs. Curwen recommends not singing together or playing together, but the teacher displaying and the child imitating. So if I was just going to sing some 1 pulse notes, I would snap or clap a beat, and then I would sing ta, 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 keep my beat going, and have the child imitate. So now we're introducing this name of ta that we're going to assign to our 1 pulse notes for the time being. So finally, in preliminary lesson 4, and this is also the same lesson when we introduce the picture of the staff, we're going to also introduce the picture of a 1 pulse note. So now we're at the point we're going to show the student what a 1 pulse note looks like. We've been able to hear or listen for a 1 pulse note, and we've been able to identify a 1 pulse note by listening. So then we show the student what a 1 pulse note looks like. So I would draw one for my child, for my student, and I take a small whiteboard with me to lessons, so that's what I would use. After I draw a 1 pulse note, I would have the student draw a couple 1 pulse notes as well. So we've already talked about accent and pulse and measure with the child as well, so now we're going to show them what that looks like as well. So we draw a bar line because this represents a strong accent. So we draw our bar line, then our quarter note or our 1 pulse note. We draw another 1 pulse note, and we draw a bar line, which represents our next accented pulse. And then our weak pulse, then another bar line, our strong pulse, and our weak pulse, and then finally 1 more bar line. So I'm going to sing this to the child so they can hear what it would sound like with our accented pulses. Ta, 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 ta. And then I would have the child sing it as well. So at this point, we've allowed the child to see what they've already heard. So in conclusion of all of this, I wanted to point out something that Mrs. Curwen had in one of the introductions to one of her earlier editions of her book. She says, "Some time ago in a discussion after one of my lectures, a speaker said he thought the process I had described would be a very roundabout way of teaching the lines and spaces and the meaning of an eighth note, half note, and quarter note. It would be much easier to just tell them all about it and have done with it. The same idea may occur to the superficial reader into whose hands the book may fall for the first time, for that has certainly been the process by which some of us managed to learn. But telling them about it is not teaching. Making them observe and discover is teaching." So I understand that this video did appear to be quite a roundabout way of teaching a quarter note. And you will find this woven through Mrs. Curwen's book often, where we allow the child to understand fully the concept of a quarter note before teaching them a quarter note, if that makes sense. We have them listen to music to find that pulse or the throb, and then we define that pulse or the throb. And then we have them listen again to see if they can identify a one pulse note versus a two pulse note. So they're doing listening and they're discovering. And then only then, after they feel this pulse and this throb, and after they're able to identify a one pulse note versus a two pulse note, that is then when we teach the symbol for the one pulse note. One of the maxims that Mrs. Curwen has in her book is that we teach the thing before the sign, and that you will see as we have learned this very long yet thorough way of teaching a quarter note to our students.